So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, wherever you are, you're probably within a few hundred miles of a body of water that connects to the single largest feature on the surface of the Earth, the ocean. It covers about 71% of the planet's surface. It holds roughly 321 million cubic miles of water. If you took all the land on Earth, every mountain, every continent, every island, and dumped it into the ocean, the water would still cover the entire globe to a depth of about 2 miles. The ocean is, by almost any measure, the dominant feature of this planet. It's not even close. And here's the thing that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of our own ocean. That's not a metaphor. That's not an exaggeration for effect. We have better maps of Mars, better topographic data of Venus, better images of the far side of the Moon than we do of the ocean floor right here on Earth. As of the mid-2020s, roughly 80% of the ocean floor has never been mapped with modern sonar. 80%. We've explored maybe 5% of the ocean in any meaningful sense, which means that the vast majority of the largest habitat on the planet, the place where life on Earth actually began, the system that regulates our climate, generates our oxygen, drives our weather, and feeds billions of people, is essentially unknown to us. We're living next to this enormous, ancient, impossibly deep thing, and we've barely even peeked inside. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The ocean. Everything confusing about it. Everything we still don't understand. And there's a lot, I promise you. We're going to go deep, literally, and take our time. No rush. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The ocean will still be there. It's not going anywhere. It's been here for about 4 billion years. And honestly, that patience is one of the things we don't fully understand about it either. Let's start with something that seems like it should be simple. Something so basic you might not even think to question it. Water. Just plain water. The stuff you drink, the stuff you shower in, the stuff that fills the ocean. Here's what's strange. Water is one of the most anomalous substances in all of chemistry. It breaks the rules that almost every other molecule follows, and it breaks them in ways that happen to be essential for life. That's not a given. That didn't have to be the case. And some of those anomalies, even now, aren't fully explained. Start with density. Almost every substance in the universe gets denser as it gets colder. That makes intuitive sense, right? Cold things contract. Molecules pack tighter together. And water does that, until it hits about 4 degrees Celsius, right around 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, something weird happens. Water starts to expand. It gets less dense. And when it freezes into ice, it's about 9% less dense than liquid water. That's why ice floats. And if you're thinking, yeah, of course, ice floats. Everyone knows that, sure. But think about what it means. In almost every other substance, the solid sinks. Solid iron sinks in molten iron. Solid wax sinks in liquid wax. But solid water floats on top of liquid water. And this one anomaly is arguably the reason life exists on this planet. Here's why. If ice sank, then every winter, the ice forming on the surface of lakes and oceans would sink to the bottom. More water would be exposed at the surface, more ice would form. It would sink too, and eventually, the entire body of water would freeze solid from the bottom up. The oceans would have frozen solid billions of years ago, and probably never thawed. Instead, ice forms on top, acts as an insulating blanket, and the water underneath stays liquid. Fish survive the winter. Microorganisms keep living. The ocean doesn't turn into a ball of ice, all because water breaks the density rule that nearly every other molecule follows. The reason it does this has to do with hydrogen bonding, the way water molecules form a crystalline lattice as they freeze, with the hydrogen bonds holding the molecules in a slightly spread-out arrangement. But the full picture of water's behavior, under different temperatures and pressures, is still an active area of research. There are at least 17 known forms of ice, some of which only exist at extreme pressures found deep in the mantles of icy moons. The simple substance filling your glass is, at a molecular level, one of the strangest liquids in existence. And then there's the ocean's saltiness, which seems straightforward enough until you start asking questions. Seawater is about 3.5% salt by weight, and it's been roughly that salty for at least the last billion years or so. The salt comes from rivers washing minerals off the land, and from hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, dissolving minerals out of hot rock. But here's the puzzle. Rivers have been carrying salt into the ocean for billions of years. Why hasn't the ocean gotten saltier and saltier over time? Where does the salt go? The answer is complicated and involves multiple processes. Salt gets locked up in evaporite deposits when arms of the sea dry out. It gets subducted into the Earth's mantle along with oceanic crust. It gets incorporated into the shells and skeletons of marine organisms. But the balance of these inputs and outputs, the reason the ocean has maintained roughly the same salinity for so long, isn't perfectly understood. It's a dynamic equilibrium, and the details of how all the pieces fit together are still being worked out. Now, let's talk about how humans actually started trying to understand this enormous thing. Because for most of history, the ocean was just something you sailed across. You cared about the surface, the winds, the currents, the waves, because that's what determined whether you lived or died on a voyage. What was underneath? Nobody knew, and frankly, nobody much cared. The depths were the realm of monsters and myth, sea serpents, the kraken, mermaids. Even as late as the 17th and 18th centuries, when European powers were mapping coastlines and trade routes with increasing precision, the deep ocean was essentially a black box. The first person who really tried to change that, who looked at the ocean and said, "We need to understand this as a scientific system," was an American naval officer named Matthew Fontaine Maury. In the 1840s and 1850s, Maury did something that seems obvious in hindsight, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. He collected ships' logbooks, thousands of them. Every merchant vessel and naval ship that crossed the Atlantic kept logs recording wind speed, current direction, water temperature, weather conditions. These logs were just sitting in warehouses, gathering dust. Maury gathered them up, systematized the data, and produced the first comprehensive maps of ocean winds and currents. His 1855 book, The Physical Geography of the Sea, is sometimes called the first textbook of oceanography. It wasn't always right. Maury didn't have the tools or the theory to explain a lot of what he observed, but it was the first serious attempt to treat the ocean as something that could be studied, measured, and understood through data. But the real birth of oceanography, the moment the field truly began, came with a single voyage that left Portsmouth, England, on December 21, 1872. It was a ship called HMS Challenger, a former Royal Navy warship that had been converted into a floating laboratory. The expedition was organized by the Royal Society of London, and it was led scientifically by a Scottish naturalist named Charles Wyville Thomson. And what they set out to do was, at the time, without precedent. They were going to systematically explore the deep ocean. They were going to measure its depths, sample its water, dredge its floor, and catalog whatever living things they found down there. The Challenger expedition lasted 3.5 years. The ship sailed nearly 70,000 nautical miles, crossed every ocean except the Arctic, and made 362 observation stations along the way. At each station, they would stop, lower a weighted line to measure the depth, lower bottles to collect water samples at various levels, drag nets along the bottom to collect specimens, and measure water temperature at different depths. The equipment was crude by modern standards. Measuring depth meant literally lowering miles of hemp rope with a lead weight on the end and waiting to feel it hit bottom. It took hours at every station. The work was exhausting, monotonous, and seasick-making. Several crew members deserted. One committed suicide. It was not a glamorous voyage, but the results were extraordinary. The Challenger expedition discovered over 4,000 new species. They found that the deep ocean floor was not the barren, lifeless wasteland most people had assumed. It was teeming with life, strange and unfamiliar life, adapted to conditions that seemed impossible. They discovered the mid-Atlantic ridge, although they didn't understand what it was. They measured depths that stunned the scientific world. In the western Pacific, near the Mariana Islands, they recorded the deepest sounding of the entire voyage, about 26,850 feet. It was the first hint of what we now know as the Mariana Trench, the deepest place on Earth. The scientific reports from the Challenger expedition took 23 years to publish, 50 volumes filling over 29,000 pages. Charles Wyville Thomson died before they were completed, and the job of finishing them fell to a Canadian-born naturalist named John Murray, who is sometimes called the father of modern oceanography, and those 50 volumes essentially created the field. Before the Challenger, the deep ocean was myth and speculation. After the Challenger, it was data, imperfect, incomplete, often confusing data, but data, something to argue about, build on, test, and extend. And the first thing that data made clear was just how much we didn't know, because the Challenger had sampled 362 points in an ocean that covers 140 million square miles. That's like trying to understand the ecology of the entire United States by examining 362 random handfuls of dirt. The ocean was clearly complex, clearly alive, clearly governed by processes nobody had expected, and the instruments of the 1870s were nowhere near adequate to the task of understanding those processes. They could measure depth with a rope. They could sample water with a bottle. But the forces that drive the ocean, the deep currents, the chemistry, the biology of the abyss, those were still completely hidden. It would take another 100 years of technological development before we could even begin to see what was really down there. And what we found, when we finally had the tools to look, was so strange, so thoroughly unexpected, that it rewrote our understanding of life itself. But before we get to that story, the story of what lives in the deepest, darkest, most extreme places on Earth, we need to talk about what those places are actually like, because the deep ocean is an environment so alien, so hostile to everything we know about on the surface, that the fact that anything lives there at all is one of the most astonishing facts in all of biology. Think about the conditions. Start with pressure. At the surface of the ocean, you're under 1 atmosphere of pressure. That's the weight of the air above you, about 14.7 pounds per square inch. For every 10 meters you descend into the ocean, every 33 feet, the pressure increases by 1 additional atmosphere. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, almost 11,000 meters down, the pressure is over 1,000 atmospheres. That's about 16,000 pounds per square inch. Imagine an area the size of your thumbnail, and now imagine stacking 16,000 pounds on top of it. That's the crushing force that exists in the deepest places on Earth, every second of every day. Then there's the darkness. Sunlight can only penetrate so far into water. The upper layer, where enough light gets through for photosynthesis, the photic zone, extends down to about 200 meters, maybe 650 feet, depending on water clarity. Below that, you're in the twilight zone, where some dim light filters down but not enough for plants to grow. By about 1,000 meters, it's pitch black. Permanently, totally black. No sunlight has ever reached those depths. The deep ocean is the largest habitat on Earth, and it exists in perpetual night. And it's cold. Near the surface, ocean temperatures vary with latitude and season, just as you'd expect. Tropical surface waters can be 80 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer. But below about 1,000 meters, the temperature drops to just a few degrees above freezing everywhere, regardless of where you are on the globe. The deep ocean from pole to pole is consistently cold, typically between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius. That cold, dense water sank from the surface near the poles, sometimes centuries or even millennia ago, and it sits in the abyss, slowly circulating. So you've got crushing pressure, total darkness, and near-freezing temperatures. For most of scientific history, the assumption was that nothing could live down there. Nothing complex, anyway. Edward Forbes, a prominent naturalist of the 1840s, proposed what he called the azoic hypothesis, the idea that below about 300 fathoms, roughly 600 meters, the ocean was devoid of life. It was a reasonable guess, given what was known at the time. No light, extreme pressure, extreme cold. What could possibly survive? The Challenger expedition had already started to disprove this, pulling up strange creatures from thousands of meters down. But the real revelations came much later, starting in the 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s and beyond, as submersibles and remotely operated vehicles finally gave humans eyes in the deep. And the single most shocking discovery, the one that genuinely rewrote biology textbooks, happened on February 17, 1977, on a dive to the Galapagos Rift in the Eastern Pacific. A team of geologists from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, using the submersible Alvin, dove to about 2,500 meters to investigate a feature they had detected with temperature sensors: anomalously warm water on the ocean floor. They were expecting to find hydrothermal vents, places where seawater seeps into cracks in the Earth's crust, gets superheated by contact with hot rock near the underlying magma, and jets back out into the ocean. That's what they went looking for, and that's what they found. But what they didn't expect, what nobody on the planet expected, was the life. Around those vents, in total darkness, at crushing pressure, in water that reached temperatures of over 300 degrees Celsius where it emerged from the vents, although the surrounding water was cold enough that the extreme heat was very localized. There were ecosystems. Dense, thriving, abundant ecosystems. Giant tube worms, some of them 6 feet long, with bright red plumes. Clusters of enormous clams and mussels. Clouds of shrimp, crabs, fish, octopuses. An entire food web, totally independent of sunlight. Think about what that means. Before 1977, every ecosystem known to science was ultimately powered by the sun. Plants or algae capture sunlight through photosynthesis, and everything else eats the plants, or eats the things that eat the plants. That's the food chain. Sunlight in, life out. It was considered a fundamental rule of biology, and in one dive, that rule was broken. The vent ecosystems run on chemosynthesis. Bacteria at the base of the food chain don't use sunlight for energy. They use chemical energy. Specifically, they oxidize hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals spewing out of the vents. These chemosynthetic bacteria are the primary producers, the equivalent of plants on the surface, and everything else in the vent ecosystem feeds on them, either directly or indirectly. The giant tube worms, for instance, have no mouth, no stomach, no digestive tract at all. Instead, they have a specialized organ called a trophosome that's packed with billions of chemosynthetic bacteria. The worms absorb hydrogen sulfide from the vent water and deliver it to these internal bacteria, which convert it into usable energy. It's a symbiosis. The worm provides a home and raw materials. The bacteria provide food. Neither can survive without the other. The discovery of hydrothermal vent ecosystems didn't just add a new chapter to biology. It forced scientists to fundamentally reconsider where life can exist. If life can thrive at crushing pressure, in total darkness, in water laced with chemicals that would be toxic to almost anything on the surface, then the range of conditions compatible with life is vastly wider than anyone had thought. And that realization immediately changed how scientists thought about other places in the solar system. Jupiter's moon Europa has a vast ocean of liquid water beneath its icy surface. Saturn's moon Enceladus has geysers of water erupting from its south pole, and the Cassini spacecraft detected hydrogen gas in those plumes, exactly the kind of chemical that hydrothermal vents produce. If life can exist at hydrothermal vents on Earth's ocean floor, then maybe, just maybe, it can exist on the floors of alien oceans too. The search for extraterrestrial life was reshaped by what we found at the bottom of our own sea, and we keep finding more. Since 1977, hundreds of hydrothermal vent fields have been discovered along mid-ocean ridges around the world, in the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic, the Southern Ocean. Each one has its own community of organisms, many of them found nowhere else on Earth. The diversity is staggering, and new species are being described faster than taxonomists can keep up. In 2000, a research team discovered a different type of deep-sea vent system near the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a field of towering white carbonate chimneys they named the Lost City. These aren't volcanic like the black smoker vents on mid-ocean ridges. They're formed by a chemical reaction between seawater and the rock of the oceanic crust, a process called serpentinization. The chemistry is different, the biology is different, and some scientists believe that this type of environment, alkaline, hydrogen-rich, warm but not scalding, might be the kind of place where life on Earth first originated over 4 billion years ago. But here's what's really humbling about all of this. We've explored a tiny fraction of the deep ocean floor. There could be vent systems, cold seeps, brine pools, and other extreme environments down there that we haven't even imagined yet, supporting ecosystems we can't predict. The ocean floor covers more area than all the continents combined, and most of it is unmapped and unexplored. Every time a submersible descends into a new area, there's a real chance of discovering something completely new. In 2023 alone, deep-sea expeditions documented hundreds of species new to science. Not rare variants of known species, entirely new species, never seen before by human eyes. That's happening right now, in the 21st century, on our own planet. And the creatures themselves, even the ones we've found, are confounding. The deep ocean is home to animals that seem almost designed to challenge our understanding of biology. Consider bioluminescence. In the deep sea, between about 200 and 1,000 meters, the majority of organisms produce their own light. Not a few oddities, the majority. Estimates vary, but some researchers believe that over 75% of deep-sea organisms are bioluminescent. They glow. In the darkest environment on Earth, the animals have evolved to make their own illumination. Jellyfish that pulse with blue-green light. Fish with rows of photophores along their bellies, creating a counter-illumination that camouflages their silhouette against the dim light filtering down from far above. Anglerfish, dangling a bioluminescent lure in front of their enormous mouths, fishing for prey in the darkness. The vampire squid, which is neither a squid nor a vampire, but a living fossil from a lineage that split off from other cephalopods hundreds of millions of years ago, has photophores all over its body, and can release a cloud of bioluminescent mucus to confuse predators. And the deep-sea dragonfish has bioluminescent organs near its eyes that produce red light, which is remarkable because most deep-sea creatures can only see blue light. The dragonfish can essentially illuminate its prey with a wavelength its prey can't detect. It has a private spotlight. It's hunting with an invisible flashlight. The deep-sea anglerfish, by the way, deserves a longer look because its biology is so bizarre it borders on science fiction. The females are the ones you've seen pictures of, the nightmarish face, the enormous mouth, the dangling bioluminescent lure. But the males are something else entirely. In many species of deep-sea anglerfish, the males are tiny, a fraction of the size of the females. When a male finds a female in the vast darkness of the deep ocean, itself an astonishing feat, given how sparse the population is and how dark the environment, he bites into her skin and doesn't let go. Over time, his body fuses with hers. His bloodstream connects to her bloodstream. His organs atrophy. His eyes degenerate. He becomes, essentially, a parasitic appendage, a permanent source of sperm, attached to the female's body for the rest of their shared life. It's one of the most extreme examples of sexual dimorphism in the animal kingdom, and it evolved, scientists believe, as a solution to the fundamental problem of finding a mate in an environment where encounters are incredibly rare. If finding a partner is a once-in-a-lifetime event, you don't let go. The chemistry of bioluminescence involves a molecule called luciferin reacting with an enzyme called luciferase, and this system has evolved independently in marine organisms at least 40 or 50 times. That's convergent evolution on a massive scale. The deep ocean is so dark, and light is so useful down there, that organism after organism has independently stumbled onto the same chemical trick. Why so many times? How do the genetics work across such distantly related species? These are questions biologists are still actively researching. And then there are the organisms that defy our sense of what animals can be. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, was known for centuries only from dead specimens washed ashore, and the sucker scars found on the skin of sperm whales. It lives in the deep ocean, probably at depths between 300 and 1,000 meters, and despite being one of the largest invertebrates on Earth, up to 13 meters long, including the tentacles, it wasn't filmed alive in its natural habitat until 2004, when a Japanese team, led by Tsunemi Kubodera, got still images near the Ogasawara Islands, and it wasn't captured on video in the deep until 2012. An animal the size of a school bus, living in our own ocean, and it took until 2012 to film it. That tells you something about how vast and how difficult the deep ocean is to observe. And the giant squid isn't alone in its elusiveness. The colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni, is even more mysterious, thought to be shorter but more massive than the giant squid, with rotating hooks on its tentacles, living in the deep waters of the Southern Ocean. Almost everything we know about it comes from specimens pulled from the stomachs of sperm whales or caught accidentally by deep-sea fishing trawlers. We've never observed one alive in the wild. The deep ocean is full of animals we know only from fragments, carcasses, and the evidence they leave on other creatures. Or consider the siphonophores, colonial organisms made up of thousands of individual animals called zooids, each specialized for a different function, all working together as a single unit. The Portuguese man-o'-war is a siphonophore, though it lives at the surface. In the deep sea, siphonophores can reach extraordinary lengths. In 2020, researchers off the coast of Western Australia, using a remotely operated vehicle, documented a siphonophore in the genus Apolemia that measured an estimated 150 feet long, making it potentially the longest animal ever recorded. 150 feet, longer than a blue whale. And most people have never heard of it, because it lives in the deep ocean, far from human sight, doing whatever it is that 150-foot colonial organisms do down there in the dark. The deep ocean is, in many ways, the last great frontier of biology on Earth. And what makes it so frustrating for scientists is that every answer seems to generate 10 new questions. You discover vent ecosystems and immediately wonder, how do larvae travel between vent fields that are hundreds of miles apart? The vents themselves are geologically short-lived, lasting decades to maybe a few centuries before the underlying heat source shifts. So the organisms living there can't stay forever. They have to disperse. Their larvae have to somehow cross miles of cold, barren ocean floor to find the next vent. How? Carried by deep currents, presumably. But the details of larval dispersal in the deep sea are still poorly understood. It's like discovering a chain of oasis towns in the desert and then trying to figure out how people get from one to the next without roads or maps. And then there's the question that lurks beneath all of this, the really big one. How much life is down there that we haven't found? The deep ocean is the largest biome on the planet, and it's the one we know the least about. Current estimates of the total number of species in the ocean range from several 100,000 to over 2 million, and those estimates have enormous uncertainty. We might have described as few as a third of all ocean species. Every deep-sea expedition brings back unknowns. The Census of Marine Life, a massive international project that ran from 2000 to 2010, documented about 250,000 known marine species and estimated that at least another 750,000 remained to be discovered. And that estimate may itself be conservative. So the deep ocean is teeming, it's strange, it's barely explored, and it's full of life that operates by rules we're still figuring out. But the deep sea isn't the only part of the ocean that confounds us, because even the water itself, the way it moves, the patterns it follows, the way it distributes heat around the planet, is governed by systems so vast and so complex that our understanding of them is, honestly, still pretty rudimentary. And the most important of these systems, the one that quietly shapes the climate of the entire planet, is something that most people have never heard of. It's called the thermohaline circulation, or sometimes the global ocean conveyor belt, and it's one of those things that, once you understand it, even a little, you start to realize just how precarious and how interconnected the whole climate system really is. Here's the basic idea. The ocean isn't just a big bathtub of water sitting there passively. It's a massive, slow-moving circulatory system, driven by differences in temperature and salinity. Thermo for temperature, haline for salt. Cold, salty water is denser than warm, fresh water. Dense water sinks, and when a huge volume of dense water sinks in one part of the ocean, it has to go somewhere, and other water has to flow in to replace it. That simple principle, dense water sinks, and everything else adjusts, drives a global circulation pattern that moves water through every ocean basin on the planet in a journey that takes roughly 1,000 years to complete. Let's trace the loop. Start in the North Atlantic, up near Greenland and Iceland and the Norwegian Sea. This is one of the most important regions in the entire global climate system, and most people couldn't point to it on a map. Here, warm, salty water from the Gulf Stream arrives at high latitudes. As it moves north, it loses heat to the cold Arctic air. It cools. And crucially, when sea ice forms in winter, the freezing process rejects salt. Ice crystals are essentially pure water, so the salt gets left behind in the surrounding ocean. This makes the remaining water even saltier. So now you've got water that's both cold and salty, very dense, and it sinks. It sinks deep, plunging to depths of 2,000 to 4,000 meters, forming a mass of deep water that oceanographers call North Atlantic deep water. This sinking water then flows southward along the bottom of the Atlantic, crawling along at speeds you'd measure in centimeters per second. It takes centuries. It flows past the equator, past South America, all the way to the Southern Ocean, where it meets and mixes with the frigid waters surrounding Antarctica. From there, it gets pulled into the deep circulation of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, slowly, spreading through the abyssal basins of those massive ocean bodies. Eventually, far from where it sank, this deep water gradually warms and rises back toward the surface, a process called upwelling, and then surface currents carry it back toward the North Atlantic to start the cycle again. The whole loop, sinking in the North Atlantic, flowing deep through the Atlantic and Southern Oceans, spreading into the Indian and Pacific, upwelling, returning on the surface, takes on the order of 1,000 years. Water that's sinking near Greenland right now won't return to the surface in the Pacific for roughly a millennium. Think about that. There's water moving through the deep ocean right now that sank during the height of the medieval period. Water that was last at the surface when the Normans were conquering England is currently creeping along the floor of the Pacific. And this circulation isn't just an interesting curiosity. It's a heat engine. The Gulf Stream, which is part of the surface return flow of this system, carries an almost inconceivable amount of heat northward. It's estimated that the Gulf Stream and its extension, the North Atlantic Current, deliver roughly 1.4 petawatts of heat from the tropics to the North Atlantic. A petawatt is 1,000,000 billion watts. To put that in perspective, the total power consumption of all of human civilization is about 18 terawatts, roughly 1% of what the Gulf Stream is carrying. That heat is what keeps Western Europe so much warmer than you'd expect for its latitude. London is at about the same latitude as Calgary, Alberta. Oslo is at the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska. But London doesn't have Canadian winters, and Oslo doesn't feel like Alaska. And the main reason is that the ocean is constantly delivering tropical heat to their doorstep. Now here's where it gets scary. There's a growing body of evidence that this circulation system, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, as scientists call the Atlantic component, is slowing down. And if it slows down enough, or if it collapses, the consequences for global climate could be dramatic. The concern is rooted in what's happening in the Arctic and around Greenland. As the planet warms, the Greenland ice sheet is melting at an accelerating rate, pouring enormous volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic. At the same time, increased precipitation and river runoff in the Arctic are adding more fresh water. This fresh water is less dense than salty water. It dilutes the saltiness of the surface water in the regions where deep water formation is supposed to happen. And if the water at the surface isn't salty enough, it won't be dense enough to sink. If it doesn't sink, the conveyor belt slows down. If the conveyor belt slows down enough, the whole pattern of global heat distribution shifts. This isn't just theoretical. Measurements of the AMOC over the past 2 decades, primarily from a monitoring array called RAPID, deployed across the Atlantic at 26.5 degrees north, suggest that the circulation has already weakened, possibly by as much as 15% compared to the mid-20th century. Some climate models predict further weakening over the coming decades. A few studies have suggested the AMOC could be approaching a tipping point, a threshold beyond which it would rapidly collapse into a much weaker state, possibly shutting down almost entirely. If that happened, the effects would include rapid cooling of Europe, shifts in monsoon patterns affecting billions of people in Asia and Africa, changes in rainfall across the Americas, and acceleration of sea level rise along the eastern coast of North America. But here's the thing, and this is important. We don't really know where that tipping point is. We don't even know for certain that there is a sharp tipping point, as opposed to a gradual slowdown. The climate models disagree with each other on the timing and the severity. Some models show the AMOC weakening but remaining stable through the 21st century. Others show it approaching collapse by mid-century. The observational record is short. RAPID has only been running since 2004, and 20 years is a blink of an eye for a system that operates on millennial timescales. We're trying to understand a process that unfolds over centuries using data we've been collecting for decades. And there's a deeper uncertainty beneath all of this. The thermohaline circulation interacts with every other part of the climate system: the atmosphere, the ice sheets, the biosphere. Changes in one part ripple through all the others in ways that are ferociously difficult to predict. This is the fundamental challenge of ocean climate science. The system is so interconnected, so full of feedback loops, that isolating one variable and predicting its behavior is like trying to understand a symphony by listening to one instrument. We do know that the AMOC has collapsed before. During the last ice age, it appears to have shut down and restarted multiple times, associated with dramatic and rapid temperature swings in the North Atlantic region. The most famous of these events are called Heinrich events and Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and they show up clearly in ice cores from Greenland. During some of these events, temperatures in Greenland changed by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a matter of decades, possibly even faster. The mechanism seems to have involved massive influxes of fresh water from melting ice sheets, exactly the kind of freshwater pulse that concerns scientists today. During Heinrich events, armadas of icebergs calved off the Laurentide ice sheet, the enormous ice sheet that covered much of North America during the Ice Age, and drifted across the North Atlantic, melting and dumping fresh water as they went. The layer of fresh water capped the ocean surface, preventing the formation of deep water, and the circulation collapsed. When it did, the North Atlantic cooled dramatically. Weather patterns shifted across the entire hemisphere, and the effects rippled through ecosystems around the world. So we know the AMOC can collapse. We know it has collapsed. We know the consequences were severe. What we don't know, with any confidence, is how close the current system is to another collapse, or exactly what would trigger it, or how quickly it would happen. That uncertainty is, honestly, one of the most unsettling things about the modern ocean. We've built our civilization, our agriculture, our cities, our infrastructure, around a climate that depends on ocean circulation patterns we barely understand and cannot predict with confidence. We're flying blind in a very real sense when it comes to the behavior of the system that regulates the planet's thermostat. But ocean currents aren't just about heat. They're also about nutrients, about life, about the fundamental productivity of the marine ecosystem. And this brings us to another aspect of the ocean that's deeply confusing and critically important: the ocean's role in the global carbon cycle. Because the ocean is, right now, doing us an enormous favor. It's absorbing a significant fraction of the carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere. And the consequences of that absorption, for the ocean, for the creatures that live in it, and ultimately for us, are something we're only beginning to understand. Here's the basic picture. When carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, from burning fossil fuels, from deforestation, from industrial processes, it doesn't all stay in the air. About half of it does, but of the other half, roughly a quarter is absorbed by land ecosystems, by forests and soils, and the remaining quarter, about 25% of all the CO2 humanity produces, is absorbed by the ocean. The ocean is, by far, the largest carbon sink on the planet. How does this work? Partly through simple physics and chemistry. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater. Cold water absorbs more CO2 than warm water. For the same reason, a cold soda holds its fizz better than a warm one. So the cold waters at high latitudes absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and when that cold water sinks as part of the thermohaline circulation we just talked about, it carries that dissolved carbon dioxide into the deep ocean, where it can be stored for centuries. This is called the solubility pump, and it's a purely physical process, no biology involved. But there's a second pump, and it's biological, and it's enormous. In the sunlit upper ocean, microscopic organisms called phytoplankton, tiny photosynthetic algae, and cyanobacteria, so small you'd need a microscope to see most of them, absorb carbon dioxide from the water and use it, along with sunlight, to build their bodies. Photosynthesis, just like plants on land, but in the water. And the scale is hard to overstate. Phytoplankton produce roughly half of all the oxygen generated on Earth. Half. Every other breath you take, in a sense, was made possible by an organism you can't see, floating in seawater. And while they're making oxygen, they're also fixing carbon, pulling it out of the water and incorporating it into organic molecules. When phytoplankton die, or when they're eaten and their consumers produce waste, some of that organic carbon sinks. It falls through the water column as a constant, gentle rain of dead cells, fecal pellets, and organic detritus. Marine scientists call it marine snow, and it's one of the most important processes on Earth. This sinking organic matter carries carbon from the surface into the deep ocean, the biological pump. Some of it gets eaten and recycled on the way down. Some of it reaches the ocean floor, where it gets buried in sediment and locked away for millions of years. A fraction of it eventually becomes the organic-rich rock we know as oil shale, or even petroleum. The fossil fuels we're burning today to release CO2 were originally carbon that phytoplankton pulled out of the ancient ocean and sent sinking into the deep. So the ocean is absorbing our CO2 through both the solubility pump and the biological pump, and between them, they're removing something like 2.5 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere every year, which sounds like great news. And in one sense, it is. Without the ocean's carbon absorption, atmospheric CO2 concentrations would be significantly higher than they already are, and climate change would be further advanced. But there's a cost, a serious, chemistry-altering cost. When CO2 dissolves in seawater, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid. This lowers the pH of the ocean, making it more acidic. The process is called ocean acidification, and it's sometimes described as climate change's equally evil twin. Since the Industrial Revolution, the pH of ocean surface water has dropped by about 0.1 units, from roughly 8.2 to about 8.1. That might sound tiny, a tenth of a pH unit, but pH is a logarithmic scale, so that small numerical change represents approximately a 30% increase in acidity. The ocean is 30% more acidic now than it was before we started burning fossil fuels at industrial scale. And the organisms most vulnerable to this change are the ones that build their shells and skeletons out of calcium carbonate. Corals, mollusks, many species of plankton, sea urchins, certain types of algae. The chemistry is straightforward and brutal. As the water becomes more acidic, it becomes harder for these organisms to form calcium carbonate. Their shells get thinner. Their growth slows. In extreme cases, the water actually becomes corrosive to calcium carbonate. It starts dissolving their shells instead of allowing them to build them. Laboratory experiments have shown that some species of plankton, particularly the pteropods, tiny sea snails that are a crucial food source for fish and whales in polar waters, develop visibly corroded shells when raised in water at the pH levels projected for the end of this century. Researchers in the Southern Ocean have already observed pteropods with partially dissolved shells in the wild, not in laboratory conditions but in actual Antarctic waters. These tiny creatures sit at a critical junction in the marine food web. They're eaten by fish like salmon, herring, and cod. Those fish are eaten by larger predators. Remove the pteropods, or reduce their populations, and you send a shock wave through the entire food chain. And pteropods aren't the only organisms at risk. The larvae of many commercially important shellfish, oysters, mussels, scallops, are particularly vulnerable to acidification because they form their initial shells during a critical window of early development. Oyster hatcheries on the U.S. Pacific Northwest coast have already experienced mass larval die-offs linked to upwelling of corrosive, low pH water, giving us a preview of what a more acidic ocean might look like for shellfish aquaculture worldwide. And here's the really confusing part, the part that keeps oceanographers up at night. The biological pump, the process that carries carbon into the deep ocean, depends heavily on organisms that build calcium carbonate shells. Coccolithophores, for instance, are a type of phytoplankton that create intricate calcium carbonate plates. When they die, those plates act as ballast, helping the dead cells sink faster and more efficiently into the deep. If ocean acidification impairs these organisms, the biological pump could weaken. And if the biological pump weakens, less carbon gets transported to the deep ocean, which means more CO2 stays in the atmosphere, which means more warming, which means more CO2 absorbed by the ocean, which means more acidification. It's a feedback loop, and the direction of the feedback is deeply concerning. But whether this will actually happen, and how fast, and how severely, is genuinely uncertain. Some studies suggest that certain species of coccolithophores can adapt to lower pH over multiple generations. Others suggest they can't, or at least not fast enough to keep pace with the rate of change. The ocean acidification research field is relatively young. The term itself wasn't widely used until the early 2000s, and the long-term biological and ecological consequences are still being mapped out. And the uncertainties don't stop there. There's something oceanographers call the missing carbon problem, and it's been nagging at scientists for decades. When you add up all the CO2 we've emitted, and you subtract what's stayed in the atmosphere and what the ocean and land ecosystems have absorbed, the numbers don't quite balance. There's carbon that's been absorbed somewhere, but we can't fully account for where it went. The discrepancy isn't huge, maybe 10 to 15% of total emissions, but for a system this important, any unaccounted carbon is a mystery worth solving. Some of it may be going into deep ocean sediments. Some may be absorbed by coastal ecosystems, mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, that are hard to measure globally. Some may be in parts of the ocean that aren't well sampled. But the honest answer is that we don't have a complete carbon budget for the planet, and the ocean is the biggest source of uncertainty. Phytoplankton themselves remain deeply mysterious, despite their enormous importance. We know they produce half the world's oxygen. We know they form the base of most marine food webs. We know they play a critical role in the carbon cycle. But we don't fully understand what controls their abundance, their distribution, or their productivity. Satellite observations show that global phytoplankton populations may have declined by roughly 40% since 1950, though those numbers are controversial and depend on how you interpret sparse historical data. If that decline is real, it's alarming. It would mean the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon and produce oxygen is diminishing at the same time that we're adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. But the data is noisy. The historical baseline is poor, and different research groups have reached different conclusions. We're trying to track changes in populations of organisms we can barely see, spread across an ocean we can barely measure, over timescales that exceed our observational record. And that brings us to maybe the most honest thing you can say about the ocean's role in the carbon cycle and climate change. We know enough to be seriously worried, and not enough to be confidently predictive. The ocean is doing something enormous for us right now, by absorbing our excess CO2. But we don't fully understand the limits of that service, the side effects of that absorption, or how long it can continue. We're conducting an uncontrolled experiment on the largest chemical system on Earth, and we're not entirely sure what the results will be. But the ocean isn't just confusing when you look at its chemistry or its biology. It's confusing when you listen to it too, because the ocean is an acoustic world, and the sounds it produces, and the sounds that travel through it, are strange, vast, and in some cases, completely unexplained. And that's where the story takes a turn that feels almost like science fiction, because the ocean is not quiet. It's full of sound, and sound behaves in water in ways that are so different from how it behaves in air that it took scientists decades to figure out the basics, and there are aspects of ocean acoustics that remain genuinely mysterious. Start with a simple fact. Sound travels much faster in water than in air. About 4.5 times faster, roughly 1,500 meters per second, compared to about 340 meters per second in air. And it travels much farther. In air, sound fades quickly, a few miles at most for even the loudest noises. In water, under the right conditions, sound can travel thousands of miles, literally thousands. And the reason it can do this has to do with a feature of the ocean that was discovered during World War II, and that turned out to be one of the most remarkable acoustic phenomena in nature. It's called the SOFAR channel. SOFAR stands for Sound Fixing and Ranging. Here's what's going on. The speed of sound in water depends on 3 things: temperature, salinity, and pressure. Temperature and salinity affect it in complicated ways, but the big picture is this. Sound speed decreases as temperature drops, and increases as pressure increases. Now, in the ocean, temperature generally decreases with depth. It gets colder as you go down. So in the upper ocean, the speed of sound is decreasing. But at depth, even though it's still cold, the increasing pressure starts to dominate, and the speed of sound begins to increase again. This creates a minimum, a depth where the speed of sound is at its lowest, typically somewhere between about 700 and 1,200 meters down, depending on where you are in the world. And this minimum acts as a waveguide. Sound waves that enter this layer get trapped in it. If a sound wave tries to move upward out of the channel, it enters water where the sound speed is higher, and it gets refracted, bent, back downward. If it tries to move downward, same thing. Higher sound speed below the minimum pushes it back up. The sound bounces back and forth within this channel, never escaping, traveling horizontally for enormous distances with very little energy loss. It's like a fiber optic cable for sound, but made of water. The SOFAR channel was discovered independently by Maurice Ewing at Columbia University and Leonid Braikovskik at the Soviet Academy of Sciences in the late 1940s. The U.S. Navy immediately recognized its potential and developed a system where downed pilots could drop small explosive charges into the water. The sound from the explosion would be captured by the SOFAR channel and travel across the ocean to underwater listening stations, which could triangulate the position of the explosion. It was a search and rescue tool, and it worked. But the SOFAR channel is also used by the ocean's own inhabitants. And here's where things get really interesting. Blue whales, the largest animals ever to exist on Earth, up to 100 feet long and nearly 200 tons, produce extraordinarily low-frequency sounds. Some of their calls are below the range of human hearing, at frequencies as low as 10 to 20 hertz. And at those frequencies, in the SOFAR channel, The sound can travel for thousands of miles. Blue whales, separated by entire ocean basins, may be able to hear each other. Think about that. An animal in the Atlantic producing a call that can be detected by another animal near Antarctica. Before human noise pollution, before ship engines and sonar and seismic surveys filled the ocean with artificial sound, the natural ocean may have been a vast acoustic commons where whales communicated across distances we can barely comprehend. And here's something genuinely puzzling. There's a phenomenon known to whale researchers as the worldwide decline in blue whale call frequency. Over the past several decades, the fundamental frequency of blue whale calls has been getting lower. Not by a lot, maybe a fraction of a hertz per year, but consistently, across every population of blue whales studied, in every ocean. It's been documented in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the Southern Ocean. Every group of blue whales on Earth seems to be singing at a lower pitch than it was a few decades ago, and the trend shows no sign of stopping, and nobody knows why. Theories abound. Some researchers have suggested it's related to the recovery of blue whale populations after the end of commercial whaling. As the population grows, whales don't need to call as loudly to find each other, and lower frequency calls travel farther, so they can use less energy. Others have proposed it's a response to increased ocean noise from shipping, though this seems less likely since lower frequency calls would actually be more affected by ship noise, not less. Some have suggested changes in ocean temperature, affecting the acoustic properties of the water. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the observation. It's a global phenomenon. It's been happening for decades, and it remains genuinely unexplained. The SOFAR channel has also delivered some of the most eerily captivating mysteries in modern oceanography, because the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, operates a network of underwater hydrophones, microphones, essentially, that were originally deployed by the Navy during the Cold War to listen for Soviet submarines. When those hydrophones were made available to scientists in the early 1990s, they started picking up sounds that nobody could identify. The most famous is the bloop. Detected in 1997, the bloop was an ultra-low frequency, extremely powerful sound that was picked up by hydrophones more than 3,000 miles apart across the Pacific. It was unlike any known geological, man-made, or biological source. Its characteristics resembled biological sounds. It had the profile of a living thing, but it was far too loud to have been produced by any known animal. A blue whale is the loudest animal on Earth, and the bloop was several times more powerful. For years, it sparked wild speculation. An unknown deep-sea creature of enormous size, something living in the abyss that we'd never encountered? The likely answer, eventually arrived at by NOAA scientists, is less dramatic but still fascinating. The bloop is now believed to have been an icequake, the sound of a large iceberg cracking and fracturing as it grinds along the ocean floor near Antarctica. When scientists compared the bloop's acoustic signature to known icequake sounds, the match was good. But here's the thing. The case isn't completely closed. The identification is based on similarity, not direct observation. Nobody watched an iceberg make that specific sound. And there are other unexplained sounds in the NOAA catalog that haven't been as neatly resolved. There's Julia, detected in 1999, a strange, rising and falling sound lasting about 15 seconds that sounds eerily like a wailing voice, also attributed to ice, probably a large iceberg running aground. There's Upsweep, first detected in 1991 and recurring seasonally, a series of narrow-band upsweeping sounds that seem to come from a volcanic region in the South Pacific, but don't match any known volcanic or seismic signature. Upsweep has been going on for over 30 years and has never been conclusively explained. There's Slow Down, a sound that lasts for about 7 minutes, gradually decreasing in frequency, detected in 1997, also likely related to ice. And there's the 52 Hz whale, an individual whale that has been tracked by hydrophones since 1989, producing calls at a frequency of 52 Hz, much higher than any known species of whale. Blue whales call at 10 to 40 Hz, fin whales at around 20. This animal calls at 52, and it appears to be the only one. It's been called the loneliest whale in the world, though that's almost certainly an anthropomorphic projection. We don't know if other whales can hear it, or if it's some kind of hybrid, or if there's a simple anatomical explanation for its unusual frequency. We've never identified it visually. We just hear it, year after year, calling at a frequency no other whale matches. The ocean is an acoustic hall of mirrors. Sound bends, bounces, channels, and propagates in ways that can be counterintuitive and surprising. And our understanding of ocean acoustics, while vastly improved since the SOFAR channel was discovered, is still incomplete. We're only now beginning to understand how pervasive human noise pollution has become in the ocean and how it's affecting marine life. Shipping, sonar, seismic surveys for oil exploration, construction, all of these produce sound that travels vast distances underwater. The ambient noise level in the ocean has roughly doubled every decade since the 1960s in some frequency bands. For animals that depend on sound to communicate, navigate, find food, and avoid predators, which is most marine animals, this rising tide of noise is a growing threat that we're only beginning to study seriously. But sound isn't the only thing moving through the ocean in strange and sometimes inexplicable ways. Water itself moves in patterns that have puzzled scientists for centuries, and some of those patterns, particularly on the surface, can be lethal. Because the ocean's surface, that thin boundary between air and water where most of us experience the sea, is where some of the ocean's most dramatic and least understood phenomena occur. And the most dramatic of all, the ones that for centuries were dismissed as sailors' tall tales, are rogue waves. And the story of how rogue waves went from maritime myth to scientific fact is one of the most fascinating reversals in the history of oceanography. For as long as humans have gone to sea, sailors have told stories of enormous, solitary waves appearing without warning in otherwise moderate seas. Walls of water 60, 80, even 100 feet high, rising up suddenly and crashing down on ships before anyone could react. For most of the 20th century, oceanographers dismissed these stories. The standard mathematical models of ocean waves, based on what's called linear wave theory, predicted that waves should follow a well-behaved statistical distribution. The probability of a wave exceeding a certain height decreased exponentially. A wave twice the significant wave height, the average height of the highest third of waves, was extremely unlikely. A wave 3 times the significant wave height was, according to the math, so improbable that it should occur maybe once every 10,000 years. Basically never. The sailors were exaggerating. They had to be. The math said so. And then came January 1st, 1995. The Draupner platform, an oil rig in the North Sea, about 100 miles off the coast of Norway. The sea state that day was rough but not extraordinary. The significant wave height was about 12 meters, maybe 40 feet. Serious but not unusual for a winter storm in the North Sea. And then, at 3 in the afternoon, a single wave hit the platform. The onboard instruments measured it at 25.6 meters, 84 feet, more than twice the significant wave height. A wave that, according to standard theory, should not have existed. The instruments were checked. They were working correctly. The measurement was real. The Draupner wave, as it came to be called, was the first rogue wave to be scientifically recorded with reliable instruments. And it changed everything. Because now, the oceanographers had to explain something their models said was essentially impossible. The data was clear. The wave was real. The theory was wrong, or at least incomplete. And here's what's genuinely unsettling. Once scientists started looking for rogue waves, really looking, with satellite data and wave buoys and radar, they found that they were far more common than the standard models predicted. A 2004 study using European Space Agency satellite data found that over a 3-week period, they detected at least 10 waves that qualified as rogue, waves with heights more than twice the significant wave height, occurring around the globe. That's not once every 10,000 years. That's multiple times per week. So what causes them? That's the question. And the honest answer is, we're still figuring it out. Several mechanisms have been proposed, and the reality is probably that rogue waves can form in different ways under different conditions. One mechanism is called constructive interference. Ocean waves are not all the same size or speed. They're a chaotic mix of different wavelengths and frequencies, all overlapping and interacting. Occasionally, by random chance, several waves briefly align. Their crests coincide at the same point in space and time, and their heights add together to produce a single, much larger wave. This is basic wave physics, and it's well understood. But linear theory says this kind of extreme constructive interference should be vanishingly rare. The Draupner wave was too big and too common for simple constructive interference to explain. Another mechanism involves ocean currents. When waves travel against a strong current, the Agulhas current off the southeast coast of Africa is the classic example. The current can compress the wave energy, shortening the wavelength and increasing the height. This is known to produce dangerously large waves, and the Agulhas current region is one of the most notorious areas for rogue wave encounters. But not all rogue waves occur near strong currents. The Draupner wave was in the North Sea, far from any major ocean current. The most interesting, and most unsettling, mechanism involves what physicists call nonlinear effects. When waves become large enough, the simple linear models break down. The waves start interacting with each other in ways that linear theory doesn't capture. Energy can get focused, concentrated, funneled into a single wave in a kind of runaway process. This is related to a mathematical phenomenon called modulation instability, first described in the context of optics and fiber optics, but applicable to water waves as well. In certain conditions, a train of regular waves can spontaneously develop an instability where one wave begins to grow at the expense of its neighbors, sucking up energy and becoming a monster. It's the mathematical equivalent of the rich getting richer. A small perturbation amplifies itself, and before you know it, you've got a wave twice the size of everything around it. This nonlinear focusing mechanism has been demonstrated in laboratory wave tanks and in numerical simulations, and it may explain many rogue wave observations. But the conditions under which it occurs in the real ocean and how to predict when and where rogue waves will form are still active areas of research. Rogue waves remain, in a real sense, poorly understood. They're a reminder that even something as fundamental as how waves work on the surface of the ocean still holds surprises. And they're deadly. The European Space Agency estimated that rogue waves were responsible for sinking more than 200 supertankers and container ships between 1990 and 2004. Many of these were ships that simply disappeared without any distress call. One moment they were on the radar, the next they were gone. In the days before reliable wave measurement instruments, there was no way to confirm what had happened. The ships just vanished, and the rogue wave explanation was dismissed as superstition. One case that haunted maritime investigators for years was the loss of the MV Derbyshire in 1980. She was a British ore bulk oil carrier, the largest British ship ever built at the time, 965 feet long and loaded with iron ore, sailing through Typhoon Orchid in the western Pacific south of Japan. She vanished. No distress signal, No survivors. 44 crew members, gone. The initial investigation suggested structural failure, and there were years of legal battles over the design of the ship. But when the wreck was finally found in 1994, at a depth of over 4,000 meters, the damage pattern suggested something else, something consistent with a massive wave, or series of waves, overwhelming the ship from ahead, caving in the forward hatch covers, and flooding the cargo hold. The ship may have been struck by a rogue wave, or a series of abnormally steep waves, generated by the interaction of the typhoon's wind-driven waves with the existing swell and the Kuroshio current. We'll never know for certain, but the Derbyshire disaster helped drive the scientific re-examination of extreme wave events that was already gaining momentum after the Draupner measurement. Now, rogue waves are surface phenomena, but the ocean floor is hiding its own set of mysteries, geological ones, on a scale so vast that they literally reshape the surface of the planet. And the story of how we figured out what's happening down there, the story of plate tectonics and the ocean floor, is one of the greatest scientific revolutions of the 20th century, and one in which the ocean played the starring role. Because it was the ocean floor, not the continents, that provided the crucial evidence. And even now, decades after plate tectonics became established science, there are fundamental questions about how the process works that remain genuinely unresolved. Let's start with a fact that seems obvious now, but was genuinely revolutionary when it was first proposed. The continents move. They drift across the surface of the Earth like enormous, slow-motion rafts. And the evidence for this is so overwhelming that it's hard to believe anyone ever doubted it. Look at a map. South America and Africa fit together like puzzle pieces. The fossils on the east coast of South America match the fossils on the west coast of Africa. The geological structures on one side line up with the structures on the other. It looks like they were once joined, and they were. The person who most famously championed this idea was Alfred Wegener, a German meteorologist and geophysicist. In 1912, Wegener proposed his theory of continental drift, the idea that the continents had once been joined in a single supercontinent he called Pangaea, and had since drifted apart. The evidence he presented was compelling. The jigsaw puzzle fit of the coastlines, the matching fossils, the geological similarities, the distribution of ancient glacial deposits that only made sense if the continents had been in different positions. It was a beautiful, coherent, evidence-based theory. And the geological establishment destroyed him. The problem was the mechanism. Wegener couldn't explain how the continents moved. He suggested they plowed through the ocean floor, like ships through ice, driven by some combination of centrifugal force from the Earth's rotation and tidal forces from the Moon. The physicists calculated the forces involved and showed they were far too weak, orders of magnitude too weak, to push continents through solid rock, and without a plausible mechanism, the theory was rejected, not politely, viciously. The president of the American Philosophical Society called continental drift utter damned rot. The British geologist Philip Lake said Wegener's method was not scientific, but one in which weights are determined by which side the scale of an argument is to be dropped. Wegener was mocked, marginalized, and essentially driven out of mainstream geology. He died in 1930 on an expedition in Greenland at the age of 50, and his theory died with him, or so the geological establishment believed. It took 30 years and a world war to bring it back. And the key was the ocean floor. During and after World War II, the U.S. Navy needed detailed maps of the ocean floor for submarine warfare. They deployed echo-sounding equipment across the Atlantic, methodically mapping the bathymetry, the underwater topography, for the first time. And what they found was astonishing. The ocean floor wasn't the flat, featureless plain everyone had assumed. It had a massive mountain range running right down the middle of the Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, snaking from the Arctic to the southern tip of Africa, stretching over 10,000 miles. It was the longest mountain range on Earth, and nobody had known it was there. A geologist named Bruce Heezen and a cartographer named Marie Tharp, working at Columbia University's Lamont Geological Observatory, produced the first detailed maps of this feature in the 1950s. And Tharp noticed something remarkable. Running along the crest of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was a deep valley, a rift valley, the kind of feature you see where the Earth's crust is being pulled apart. When she pointed this out to Heezen, he initially dismissed it. A rift valley in the middle of the ocean? That sounded like continental drift, and continental drift was dead, discredited, the mark of a crank. He reportedly told Tharp it was girl talk, but the data was the data, and Tharp's mapping was meticulous. She went back to the data again and again, and the rift was there, undeniable, stretching for thousands of miles. Tharp, it's worth noting, never got to go to sea herself. Women were not allowed on the research vessels at the time. She did all of her revolutionary work from a desk in a laboratory in New York, plotting depth soundings by hand, point by point, building the most important map in the history of geology without ever seeing the features she was mapping. The rift was there. Meanwhile, other pieces were falling into place. In the early 1960s, a geologist named Harry Hess at Princeton proposed a radical idea he called seafloor spreading. Hess suggested that the ocean floor was not permanent. New oceanic crust was being created at the mid-ocean ridges, where hot material from the Earth's mantle rose to the surface, cooled, and formed new rock. This new crust then spread outward from the ridge, like two conveyor belts moving in opposite directions, and at the edges of the ocean basins, the old crust was being pushed back down into the mantle at deep ocean trenches, a process called subduction. The ocean floor was constantly being created and destroyed. It was alive. Hess published this in 1962, and he was cautious enough to call it geopoetry, a speculative essay, not a proven theory. But within a few years, the evidence became overwhelming. The clincher came from magnetic data. When lava erupts at a mid-ocean ridge and cools, the iron-bearing minerals in the rock align with the Earth's magnetic field, like tiny compass needles frozen in place. And the Earth's magnetic field periodically reverses. North becomes south, and south becomes north, for reasons that are themselves not fully understood. These reversals happen irregularly, every few 100,000 to a few million years. And when scientists measured the magnetic properties of the ocean floor near the mid-ocean ridges, they found a stunning pattern, symmetric stripes of alternating magnetic polarity, running parallel to the ridge on both sides. The rock nearest the ridge had the current polarity. The next stripe out had reversed polarity, then current again, then reversed, like a barcode, perfectly symmetrical, recording the history of magnetic reversals as new crust formed and spread outward. This was the smoking gun. Frederick Vine and Drummond Matthews, two British geologists, published the explanation in 1963, and independently, Lawrence Morley, a Canadian, had reached the same conclusion but couldn't get his paper published. Both Nature and the Journal of Geophysical Research rejected it, in one of the great editorial blunders of 20th century science. But the evidence was irrefutable. The ocean floor was spreading. New crust was forming at ridges. Old crust was being consumed at trenches. And the continents, rather than plowing through the ocean floor as Wegener had imagined, were riding on top of these moving plates, carried along passively, like luggage on a conveyor belt. By the late 1960s, the revolution was complete. Plate tectonics was established, and it unified an enormous body of previously disconnected geological observations: earthquakes, volcanoes, mountain building, ocean basins, the distribution of fossils, into a single, coherent framework. It was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, and it vindicated Wegener's basic insight, even though his proposed mechanism was wrong. But here's the thing, and this is important, because it runs against the popular impression that plate tectonics is a solved problem. There are fundamental aspects of plate tectonics that remain genuinely unresolved. We know that plates move. We know where they move. We can measure the rates with GPS to millimeter precision, but the driving forces behind plate motion are still debated. The standard textbook explanation involves convection in the mantle, hot material rising at ridges, cool material sinking at subduction zones, creating a slow churning motion that drags the plates along. But the reality is more complicated. Some geophysicists argue that the primary driving force is ridge push, the gravitational force of the elevated ridge pushing plates apart. Others argue it's slab pull, the weight of the cold, dense oceanic plate as it sinks into the mantle at a subduction zone, pulling the rest of the plate behind it, like a tablecloth sliding off a table. Most likely it's a combination of several forces, but their relative importance is still actively debated. And then there's the deep mantle, below the plates and the upper mantle, extending all the way down to the Earth's core, over 2,800 kilometers down. We can image structures in the deep mantle using seismic waves from earthquakes, a technique called seismic tomography, and what we see down there is bizarre and not well understood. There are two enormous, continent-sized blobs of anomalously hot material sitting at the base of the mantle, one beneath Africa and one beneath the Pacific. They're called Large Low Shear Velocity Provinces, or LLSVPs. Not the catchiest name. They've been there for at least hundreds of millions of years, possibly since the early formation of the Earth, and nobody is entirely sure what they are. Some geophysicists think they're piles of primordial mantle material that never got mixed in. Others think they're accumulations of dense material from subducted oceanic crust that sank all the way to the bottom. They may be related to the generation of mantle plumes, columns of hot rock rising from the deep mantle that produce volcanic hotspots like Hawaii and Iceland. But the dynamics of the deep mantle are still poorly constrained, and our images of it, while improving, are still blurry. The ocean floor itself, despite being better mapped now than ever before, still holds secrets. The Mariana Trench, the deepest place in the ocean, reaching nearly 11,000 meters at its maximum depth in the Challenger Deep, has been visited by humans only a handful of times. The first was in 1960, when Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh descended in the bathyscaphe Trieste, reaching a depth of about 10,916 meters. They spent 20 minutes on the bottom, looking through a small porthole, and reported seeing what they described as a flatfish and a shrimp, though some scientists later questioned those identifications. It would be 52 years before anyone went back. In 2012, filmmaker James Cameron made a solo descent in the deep-sea Challenger, reaching 10,908 meters and spending about 3 hours on the bottom, filming and collecting samples. What we know about the Mariana Trench is this: it's formed by the subduction of the Pacific Plate beneath the Mariana Plate. It's a curved arc stretching about 1,500 miles across the western Pacific. The pressure at the bottom is over 1,000 atmospheres. The temperature is just above freezing, and there is life down there. Amphipods, small crustaceans, have been found in traps deployed at the bottom. Microbial life thrives in the sediments. In 2014, a new species of snailfish was discovered at a depth of over 8,000 meters in the Mariana Trench, at the time, the deepest fish ever recorded. In 2023, researchers reported an even deeper sighting. The deep trenches of the ocean are not lifeless, but they are barely explored, and every expedition brings surprises. And the trenches represent one of the most important geological processes on Earth, subduction, that we still don't fully understand. When an oceanic plate subducts beneath another plate, it carries water with it, locked into the mineral structures of the rock and the sediments riding on top. This water gets released at depth as the subducting plate heats up, and it plays a crucial role in generating the magma that feeds volcanic arcs, the chains of volcanoes that ring the Pacific, the so-called Ring of Fire. But exactly how much water the subducting plates carry, how much gets released at different depths, and how much gets transported all the way into the deep mantle, these are active research questions. Some estimates suggest the oceans could be slowly losing water to the mantle through subduction, with more water going down than comes back up through volcanic degassing. If that's true, the ocean could be very slowly shrinking over geological time, but the uncertainties are large, and the timescales are so vast, hundreds of millions of years, that the question is extraordinarily difficult to answer. The geology of the ocean floor is, in many ways, a young science. Modern oceanographic research vessels with multi-beam sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and advanced sampling equipment have only been operating for a few decades. Every year, new seamounts are discovered, underwater mountains that rise from the ocean floor, often harboring unique ecosystems adapted to the hard substrate and the currents that swirl around them. There may be over 100,000 seamounts in the global ocean, and the vast majority have never been surveyed. Each one is a potential island of biodiversity in the deep sea, a habitat for corals, sponges, fish, and invertebrates that may exist nowhere else. And then there's the geology that we can see but can't explain, or at least can't explain completely. Underwater volcanoes, for instance. We know of thousands of them, mostly along mid-ocean ridges and at subduction zones, but also in unexpected places, far from plate boundaries. Hotspot volcanoes, like the ones that built Hawaii. The classic hotspot theory says these are caused by mantle plumes, stationary columns of hot rock rising from deep in the mantle, burning through the overlying plate as it moves overhead, creating a chain of volcanoes like the Hawaiian island chain. But the mantle plume hypothesis itself is controversial. Some geophysicists argue that the seismic evidence for deep mantle plumes is ambiguous, and that hotspot volcanism might be caused by shallower processes. The debate has been going on for decades and shows no signs of being resolved soon. The Earth's interior, just like its ocean, still has more questions than answers. And here's maybe the most profound geological mystery of all, one that connects the ocean floor to the biggest question in planetary science. How did the ocean get here in the first place? Where did all this water come from? You'd think we'd know, but we don't. Not for sure. The leading theories involve two sources: outgassing from the Earth's interior during the planet's early formation, as volcanic eruptions released water vapor trapped in the original rocky material, and delivery from space, via impacts from comets and water-rich asteroids during the late heavy bombardment, roughly 4 billion years ago. Both processes probably contributed, but the relative proportions are still debated. One way scientists try to answer this is by comparing the ratio of deuterium to hydrogen, the DH ratio, in ocean water to the ratios found in comets and asteroids. Deuterium is a heavy form of hydrogen, with an extra neutron in its nucleus, and different solar system bodies have different DH ratios depending on where and how they formed. Ocean water has a specific DH ratio. If comets delivered most of the ocean's water, their DH ratio should match. But the comets we've measured, like Comet 67P/Churyumov-Gerasimenko, studied by the Rosetta mission in 2014, have DH ratios that don't match well. They're generally too high. Carbonaceous chondrite meteorites, on the other hand, have pH ratios that match Earth's ocean water much more closely. So the current best guess is that most of the ocean's water came from asteroid-like bodies, not comets, with some contribution from outgassing. But the picture keeps changing as new measurements come in, and the origin of Earth's water remains one of the most active questions in planetary science. Think about that for a second. 4 billion years of ocean, trillions upon trillions of gallons of water. The single most defining feature of our planet, the thing that makes Earth unique in the solar system as far as we know, and we're still not sure where it came from. That's the ocean for you. The biggest thing on the planet, and still, fundamentally, a mystery. And yet, the answer to that mystery might help us find life elsewhere in the universe. Because if we can figure out how Earth got its ocean, we can better predict which other planets and moons might also have water, and therefore might also harbor life. The James Webb Space Telescope is now studying the atmospheres of exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars, looking for signs of water vapor, among other things. Some of those planets orbit in the habitable zone of their stars, where liquid water could exist on the surface. If we understand how common it is for rocky planets to acquire and retain their oceans, we can better estimate how common life might be in the galaxy. The origin of Earth's ocean is not just a question about our past, it's a question about our place in the cosmos. But let's bring it back to the present, back to the thing that connects all of these mysteries to your daily life. Because the ocean isn't just a subject for scientists to study from afar. It's the system that drives the weather you experience every day, that feeds billions of people, that regulates the temperature of the planet you live on. And the changes happening in the ocean right now, changes that are measurable, accelerating, and in some cases alarming, are going to shape the world you live in for the rest of your life. That's not hyperbole. That's just the physics and the chemistry and the biology playing out at a planetary scale. Start with sea level rise, because it's the most visible and the most consequential ocean change for human civilization. Global mean sea level has risen by roughly 20 centimeters, about 8 inches, since 1900. That doesn't sound like a lot, but the rate is accelerating. In the early 20th century, sea level was rising at maybe 1 to 2 millimeters per year. Now it's rising at about 3.5 to 4 millimeters per year, and the rate is increasing. Some recent satellite measurements suggest it may already be above 4 millimeters per year. If that acceleration continues, and the physics says it will, as long as the planet keeps warming, sea level could rise by anywhere from 0.5 meter to over a meter by the year 2100, depending on how much ice melts and how quickly. And the ice is the big wild card. There are 2 main sources of ice that matter for sea level: the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. Between them, they hold enough ice to raise global sea level by about 65 meters, over 200 feet, if they melted entirely. Nobody expects them to melt entirely in the foreseeable future, but even partial melting can be catastrophic. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate, currently about 270 billion metric tons per year. That's adding about 3/4 of a millimeter per year to global sea level, and the rate has roughly tripled since the 1990s. The processes are fairly well understood. Warmer air temperatures are increasing surface melting, and warmer ocean water is undermining the marine terminating glaciers, the ones that flow out to sea and calve icebergs. But the details of how the ice sheet responds to warming, the internal dynamics, the feedback loops, the tipping points, are still uncertain. Antarctica is even more uncertain, and much scarier. The East Antarctic ice sheet, which holds the majority of the world's ice, is so cold and so stable that it's not expected to contribute significantly to sea level rise in the near future. Though near future in glaciology means centuries, and even small amounts of East Antarctic melting would matter. The West Antarctic ice sheet, however, is a different story. Much of it sits on bedrock that's below sea level, and the geometry of that bedrock creates a potential instability. As the ocean warms, warm water can circulate beneath the ice shelves, the floating extensions of the ice sheet, melting them from below. As the ice shelves thin and retreat, the grounded ice behind them flows faster into the ocean. And because the bedrock slopes downward, away from the coast, as the grounding line, the point where the ice starts to float, retreats inland, it encounters deeper bedrock, which means a thicker column of ice feeding into the ocean. This is called the marine ice sheet instability, and it's a positive feedback loop. Retreat begets more retreat. Once it starts, it may be very difficult to stop. Several major glaciers in West Antarctica, Thwaites Glacier and Pine Island Glacier being the most closely watched, are already showing signs of this kind of instability. Thwaites Glacier alone holds enough ice to raise global sea level by about 65 centimeters, over 2 feet, and it's losing mass at an accelerating rate. It's sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier, which is a bit sensational, but not without basis. If Thwaites collapses, it could destabilize neighboring glaciers, potentially committing the world to several meters of sea level rise over the coming centuries. Several meters. That would reshape coastlines, displace hundreds of millions of people, and submerge some of the world's most important cities and agricultural regions. But when? How fast? That's where the uncertainty lies. Climate models give a wide range of projections for Antarctic ice loss, because the processes involved, ice dynamics, ocean circulation beneath ice shelves, calving, fracture mechanics, are extraordinarily complex and difficult to simulate. Some models show relatively modest Antarctic contribution to sea level through 2100. Others show much more. The science is advancing rapidly, but we're making decisions about coastal infrastructure, about where people live, about how we plan our cities, based on projections that have very wide error bars. And sea level rise is just one piece of the ocean climate puzzle. The ocean is warming. Over 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases has gone into the ocean, not the atmosphere. The atmosphere gets all the attention. This is the temperature that weather reports track, the thing that makes headlines. But the ocean has absorbed the vast majority of the energy. Ocean temperatures are rising at every depth, and the rate of warming has roughly doubled since the 1990s. This warming is not distributed evenly. Some regions, particularly the Arctic and parts of the Southern Ocean, are warming faster than others, and the consequences ripple through the entire marine ecosystem. Coral reefs are perhaps the most visible casualty. Corals live in a symbiotic relationship with tiny algae, called zooxanthellae, that live inside their tissues, providing them with food through photosynthesis and giving them their color. When water temperatures rise even slightly above the coral's tolerance, typically just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius above the normal summer maximum, the corals expel their zooxanthellae. The coral turns white, which is why it's called bleaching, and if the warm conditions persist for too long, the coral dies. Bleaching events have become dramatically more frequent and more severe. The Great Barrier Reef off Australia experienced mass bleaching events in 2016, 2017, 2020, 2022, and 2024. Events that would have been extremely unlikely without climate change. Globally, the world experienced its 4th global mass bleaching event in 2023 and 2024, the most extensive ever recorded, affecting reefs in every tropical ocean basin simultaneously. Coral reefs support roughly a quarter of all marine species, despite covering less than 1% of the ocean floor. Losing them would be an ecological catastrophe of the first order. Warm water also holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. So as the ocean warms, it's losing oxygen. This process is called ocean deoxygenation, and it's been measured across the global ocean. Since the 1960s, the ocean has lost roughly 2% of its dissolved oxygen. That might sound small, but oxygen is not distributed evenly in the ocean. There are already regions, called oxygen minimum zones, where dissolved oxygen is so low that most marine life can't survive. These zones are expanding. Dead zones, areas where oxygen levels are too low to support fish or other complex organisms, are growing in number and extent. There are now over 700 identified dead zones in coastal waters around the world, and they're increasing. Warming is also affecting ocean circulation, marine ecosystems, weather patterns, and the frequency and intensity of tropical cyclones. The relationship between ocean warming and hurricanes is complex, but the basic physics is clear. Hurricanes draw their energy from warm ocean water, and warmer water means more available energy. The proportion of tropical cyclones reaching the highest intensity categories, Category 4 and 5, has increased in recent decades, consistent with what theory predicts. The total number of cyclones hasn't clearly changed, but the strongest ones are getting stronger, and they're intensifying more rapidly. And then there's El Niño and La Niña, the oscillation of ocean temperatures in the tropical Pacific that affects weather patterns around the world. El Niño events, when the eastern tropical Pacific warms anomalously, are associated with droughts in Australia and Southeast Asia, heavy rains and flooding in the Americas, disruptions to monsoons in India, and changes in atmospheric circulation that affect weather thousands of miles from the Pacific. La Niña, the opposite phase, brings its own set of global impacts. These oscillations are natural. They've been occurring for thousands of years, as evidenced by coral records and sediment cores. But how climate change will affect them is one of the biggest open questions in climate science. Some models predict El Niño events will become more frequent or more intense. Others don't. The tropical Pacific is a notoriously difficult region to simulate accurately in climate models, and the disagreement among models is substantial. Given that El Niño and La Niña affect the lives of billions of people through their influence on rainfall, agriculture, fisheries, and extreme weather, this uncertainty matters enormously. So here we are, the ocean, this vast, ancient, barely explored system, is changing, right now, in ways that are measurable and in ways that are accelerating. It's warming, it's acidifying, it's losing oxygen, its circulation patterns may be shifting, its ice is melting, its sea level is rising. And our understanding of these processes, while advancing rapidly, is still incomplete. We're watching the biggest experiment in planetary history unfold in real time, and we don't have enough data, enough understanding, or enough certainty to predict exactly how it will play out. And that's both terrifying and, in a strange way, awe-inspiring, because the ocean is, and always has been, bigger than us, older than us, more complex than us, more patient than us. It was here, 4 billion years before the first human being drew breath, and it will be here long after the last one is gone. The questions it poses, about the origin of water, about the limits of life, about the dynamics of a fluid that covers most of a planet, about the feedback loops between ocean and atmosphere and ice and biology. These are some of the deepest and most important questions in all of science. And so many of them remain unanswered. We don't fully understand how the ocean's overturning circulation will respond to freshwater input from melting ice. We don't know how many species live in the deep sea. We don't know where rogue waves will form, or how to predict them reliably. We don't know why blue whales are singing lower every year. We don't know how much water the planet is losing to its own interior through subduction. We don't know how ocean acidification will reshape marine food webs over the coming decades. We don't know whether the West Antarctic ice sheet has already passed a tipping point. We can't fully explain the origin of our planet's water. We haven't mapped 80% of the ocean floor. We have better maps of Mars. But here's the thing. Not knowing isn't the same as not caring. The scientists who study the oceanographers, the marine biologists, the climate scientists, the geologists, the acoustic researchers, they're out there right now, on research vessels, in laboratories, in front of computer screens, asking these questions, and slowly, painstakingly, chipping away at the answers. New tools are helping. Autonomous underwater vehicles, robotic submarines that can operate independently for months, are mapping the ocean floor in unprecedented detail. Argo floats, a global array of nearly 4,000 robotic profilers that drift through the ocean, diving to 2,000 meters and back, measuring temperature and salinity along the way, have revolutionized our understanding of ocean heat content and circulation since the program began in 2000. Satellite altimetry measures sea level from space with millimeter precision. Deep-sea cameras and environmental DNA sampling are revealing biodiversity in places we've never been able to observe directly. We're getting better. We're learning. The picture is filling in, detail by detail, expedition by expedition, paper by paper. But the ocean is so vast and so deep and so complex that the more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to know. Every question answered opens 3 more. Every depth explored reveals something unexpected. Every model refined reveals a new uncertainty. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's even beautiful, in its way. Because the alternative, a world where the ocean held no more mysteries, where every depth was mapped and every species catalogued and every current predicted, that world would be diminished somehow. The ocean's mystery is part of its power. Its refusal to be fully known is part of what makes it magnificent. So as you lie there tonight, wherever you are, think about this. The ocean is breathing. Right now, it's absorbing heat from the atmosphere and burying it in the deep. It's absorbing carbon dioxide and turning it into carbonic acid and calcium carbonate shells and sinking particles of marine snow. Its currents are carrying warm water toward the poles and cold water toward the equator. Somewhere in the deep Pacific, water that sank near Greenland during the Middle Ages is slowly, silently moving through the abyss. Somewhere in the Mariana Trench, bacteria are thriving at pressures that would crush a submarine. Somewhere in the dark midwater, a creature nobody has ever seen is producing light through a chemical reaction that evolution has invented independently dozens of times. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, the Amuk is carrying heat that will keep London warmer than Anchorage for another winter. Somewhere in the Southern Ocean, 100-foot siphonophore is drifting through water, so cold and so dark and so deep that no human eye will ever see it. The ocean is all of this, all at once, all the time. 4 billion years old, 321 million cubic miles of water, a chemistry lab, a biological engine, a climate regulator, a geological force, an acoustic chamber, a graveyard, a nursery, a mystery. And you're lying here, on a planet that is, when you really think about it, an ocean planet. That's what Earth is. Not a land planet with some water on it. An ocean planet with some land poking through. We named it Earth, but we should have named it Sea. Let that thought settle. Let it spread out, the way water does, finding the lowest places, the quietest channels. The ocean has been doing its work since long before anyone was around to wonder about it, and it will keep going, vast and patient and full of things we haven't imagined yet. You don't need to understand all of it. Nobody does. Nobody can. It's too big, too deep, too old, too strange. But you know a little more now than you did when you started listening tonight. You know about Planck. No, not Planck. That's the wrong story. You know about the Challenger expedition, about the hydrothermal vents, about chemosynthesis, about the SOFAR channel and the bloop and the whale that sings at 52 hertz. You know about the thermohaline circulation and the amok and why London isn't as cold as Calgary. You know about ocean acidification and the biological pump and the rogue wave that rewrote the textbooks. You know about Marie Tharp and her Rift Valley and Alfred Wegener and his vindication. You know about water, strange, anomalous, life-giving water that floats when it freezes and holds its secrets in hydrogen bonds. That's a lot. That's enough for one night. The rest will wait. The ocean is patient. It's been waiting for 4 billion years. It can wait until morning. So let your breathing slow. Let the images drift. Let the deep water close over the details, soft and dark and quiet, the way it closes over everything. Eventually, the surface is calm. The depths are still. And somewhere, far below the reach of light, in water no human has ever touched, something extraordinary is happening. It's always happening. You just can't see it from here. That's all right. Close your eyes. The ocean will still be there when you wake up. It always is.